exercises. And now we move on to Unit 5. And Unit 5 is about board composition and control. So there's quite a few trade-offs to be looked at when we're talking about board composition and control. I've used this Adam Smith quote again to remind us of what we discussed in the first unit. The fact that both Adam Smith and Burley and Means claimed that investors know little about how their money would be invested, and the management had little care because it's not their money. And you know, even in Nigeria, you see that owner-managed banks actually tend to do better than non-owner-managed banks. And I think that this goes back to what Adam Smith says: it's hard to find good managers, and when you do bring in managers, they have to be monitored by a board. So I think that, you know, the corporation and the election of directors is kind of like a democracy. And this is a picture of some of the colored outfits that politicians wear in Nigeria. You see equity holders elect a group of people to watch over their investments to ensure that their capital isn't mismanaged or embezzled. And that's the same way that, you know, representatives are elected by citizens in countries, right? So as elected representatives, their purpose under the law is to protect the assets of the corporation. Again, kind of like a democracy. And this also affects who the directors represent. So for example, in countries like Germany and Japan that operate under the stakeholder model, directors are also elected to be representatives of the creditors, the banks, and the employees. So the first trade-off is the practical dilemma. As an intermediary governance mechanism, they must not only represent the owners, but also the employees. They must have good relations with the employees that are running the day-to-day firm. Therefore, their concern is not just about running the company, but also making sure that the individuals running the company run it as well as possible. Second dilemma is theoretical concerns. So this is about the directors being able to use different ways, different advantages to be able to promote the interests of the firm. So the social network theory, for example, how directors can save the company cost because of the resources they have in their social networks. The institutional theory, the fact that they sit on all these different boards and then have relationships that could be useful, and all these institutions have relationships with each other as well. And then there's the multi-theoretic view, how no single theory really can explain how the board works, but it depends on the power of the stakeholders and also the stage in the company's life cycle, where you might want different things from a board at different stages of a company's growth. And this is a scene actually from Billions. I don't think it's on Netflix, but it's about a hedge fund manager who is in the picture called Bobby Axelrod and his girlfriend. And his relationship actually ended because of a boardroom struggle, where he obviously had more of a social network and was able to influence things in the company a lot better than she was. So I wanted to go back in history before coming back to the modern day to remind us of the typical Anglo-American board. I mean, you know, before the 1920s, before the advent of formal boards, actually the people that sort of watched over investments wouldn't even buy furniture. They used to, you know, sit on these weird wooden stools to kind of save money. And I think the first kind of real formal boards came when London, from the headquarters in London, all the colonial outpost companies like the Indian Company, etc., needed to be looked after, and they had boards overseeing those. And then in the 1920s, more formal boards like the GE board started. The modern board has fewer members, more diversity, compulsory committees, and more outside directors compared to the past. There's some more trends around independent directors. Some of them I'm going to sort of delve into. So in this post-Enron world, the New York Stock Exchange requires boards to have majority outside independent directors, and all committees composed exclusively of independent directors. Before this rule came into existence, 13% of boards didn't have majority independent directors. That this on the New York Stock Exchange. There's also another trend. Compliance with board requirements is getting difficult. There's more eyes on the board. There's more shareholder activism. There are more board issues. So there's greater demands on time. Increased turnover of board members. For being on the audit committee, there needs to be a financial expertise disclosure. So it makes it really difficult for people to serve on like 10 boards like they used to. And also there's been an issue around splitting the chairman and the CEO, so that you can set the agenda to discuss perhaps difficult issues that the CEO wouldn't have discussed if he was also chairman, because the chairman sets the agenda. HP, General Motors, and Amex, all at some points in their history, passed shareholder resolutions to separate the CEO and the chairman for that reason. And it's getting more difficult to just put your friend on the board, even though it still happens. But it's getting a bit more sophisticated. So nominating committees with methodical, transparent recruiting processes are becoming more popular. Oh, I forgot to talk about the last slide, the picture on the last slide. That was Mabola Johnson, and she is the first chairman of Guinness, female chairman of Guinness, which was really exciting. So this is an interesting case about boards and board liability. Michael Ovitz, who was CEO of Disney, received $130 million in payouts, and he wasn't negligent, but he just clashed with everybody, and they said he just didn't seem to know how to run a listed company. And his compensation package and the employment agreement was negotiated without the knowledge of the rest of the board. So the question was, did the board really perform its duty in terms of, giving him this, contract that cost Disney quite a lot of money in the end? And a Supreme Court in Delaware actually ruled in favor of the board that they were right to have acted the way that they did. But I think, this case just sort of highlights some of the scrutiny that boards are currently under. Warren Buffett actually talked about sugar daddies in his report, because he was talking about, in the 2002 report, he was talking about CEOs being likable. And what he said was, that board members need to act like the young wife of an 85-year-old man. The 85-year-old man, in his example, in his letter, would ask this much younger wife if she would still love him if he lost all his money. And her reply would be, I would miss you, but I would still love you. And he said that directors should take exactly the same attitude to a CEO, no matter how likable the CEO is. But he sat on 19 public company boards at the time he wrote this letter and had interacted with 250 directors. And one of the things that he said is that he knew that most of them were good people. They just didn't know enough about the business or care enough about shareholders to be effective. And he kind of admitted his own failings too, and said that, there were some times when he was too polite and should have spoken up. And that's just the reality of being on a board, right? If the richest man in the world, the most successful investor that has ever lived, the boss of all bosses, they call him the Oracle of Omaha, couldn't speak up when he felt like it would be in the shareholder interest to speak up, then what's the hope for mere mortals? So this is sort of an easy part, just to remind you of board tasks. So the quarterly results, projections, long-term strategic goals, capital and debt structure, the need to buy or sell assets, dividend policy, research and development projects, the status of major competitors, and of course, the company's global prospects. We're going to do a deep dive into the literature again. I have a few of these in this module, so I think it's useful to see what the research is saying. This is a paper by David Erkins in the Journal of Corporate Finance, and he looks at a data set from almost 300 firms from 30 countries at the center of the financial crisis. And what he found was that firms with more independent boards and higher institutional ownership actually experienced worse stock returns during the crisis period. So it's actually a counterintuitive study, because you would think that more institutional ownership and more independent directors would actually reduce the risk of poor stock returns. But actually, firms with higher institutional ownership in his study actually took more risk, which resulted in more shareholder losses. And then firms with more independent boards actually raised more equity capital during the crisis, which led to, obviously, a wealth transfer from shareholders to debt holders. I'm assuming that he meant that the shareholders were diluted because of the extra equity. This is a case study that I really enjoyed reading because it just demonstrates so many lessons about corporate governance, about chairman CEOs, and about the importance of having a sort of independent and unbiased board of directors. James Robinson was elected chairman and CEO of American Express in 1977. And he came in with a big vision. He was going to create a financial supermarket anywhere where people were spending money. He wanted Amex to own the company. So he went on an acquisition spree. He bought a company called Shearsons for $1 billion. He bought the Boston company. He launched a JV with Warner Communications to launch a TV channel. And then sold it before it actually became super successful. He bought parts of Lehman Brothers. He bought the Trade Development Bank. He even tried to buy Disney. He wanted to make sure that anywhere in America where money was being spent, Amex would be present. However, that didn't work out. There was a $250 million loss at one of the insurance companies. A partner of one of the other acquisitions, accused Amex of a smear campaign. And all this was being reported in the media. There were accounting errors. Another company where profits were overstated, I think it was like $30 million, and the director had to be fired, and it was all really messy. There was a Boston Tea Party where all the Boston restaurant owners actually cut their Amex cards in half in the full glare of the media to protest high merchant fees on the card. There was a transaction blocked that was involving company from the UK. It was really messy, and there was just so much reputational damage, humiliation, embarrassment. And the biggest problem was Shearsons. I mean, gosh, they weren't making any money. Moody's, the ratings agency, downgraded them. It was all just very embarrassing what happened. So Robinson had been in office for about 16 years, and that's one of the longest tenures for any corporate chief ever in American history. And he was still losing about $160 million. And this was during the time of the American boom, when all the other companies were making money. So you can imagine how the board felt, or should have felt. So there was a board member called Warner who asked for a private meeting of only outside directors where he wouldn't be present. And that meeting was scheduled for 1992. It was like a dinner meeting or a supper meeting, and he called them all to the, maybe after supper, and read a letter detailing every single disastrous investment, every single mistake, all the reputational damage that Mr. Robinson had caused. And it was a really scathing letter that, really shocked the board of directors. And then he then requested for the board to fire him immediately. They did form a search committee looking for a replacement, but Robinson wasn't going. He actually decided that a guy called Gulob, who ran one of the travel-related departments, could be CEO, even though some boards wanted an outsider. But he also wanted to stay on at some position in the group. The problem was, it was like a boys' club on that board. All the directors, except two, Warner, who asked for that private meeting, and another one, had been handpicked by Robinson. And many of them had received consulting fees from him into their private consulting firms. They were also interlocking, so many of them sat on other boards with him, which made them kind of chummy and cozy. And somehow, despite everything in Warner's letter, Robinson was still able to get majority of the board to vote to retain him as an executive and install his personal person, Gulob, as the CEO. However, share price dropped, journalists started writing, institutional investors like JP Morgan started complaining, and eventually, just because of the disgrace and embarrassment, and the pressure from external people, he eventually realized that his position was untenable and resigned. Warner was actually given an award as Director of the Year because of the actions that he took with Amex. And this is just an excerpt that I'd like to read out from his acceptance speech, because it kind of highlights all the problems with boards in general and obviously with the board of Amex. He said, "The size of a board does make a difference. The American Express board had 19 members and 4 advisors. That was a large board. I believe it makes for an unwieldy number and prevents an opportunity for each member to speak freely. It's extraordinarily difficult to mount an attack on a CEO who has been in the job for a long time and who has been appointed by a majority of the board's directors. A small group of dissenting directors with a split board has very little capability to be able to do battle with a CEO who is determined to hold on and has full access to the apparatus of the corporate relations department. It's imperative to have directors who are not only independent, but who can tell the difference between a company that is having some minor difficulties, but moving to correct them with a reasonable chance of success, and a company that is in serious and potentially harmful trouble and under attack from shareholders, media, and analysts for extended poor performance. Directors unable to distinguish between these two different situations tend to circle the wagons around an embattled CEO rather than represent the owner shareholders. This, I believe, was the case with Mr. Robinson and with the majority of American Express directors. As we always seem to do in this module, we're back to ownership. And the conclusion that a lot of America's boards have actually failed to protect the interests of shareholders. But we demand a lot of them, considering they are typically selected, compensated, and informed by the very people that they're supposed to be overseeing. You see, boardroom politics are typically dominated by the CEO, who has full access to the full apparatus of the PR department, as well as other establishment figures. So in addition to the traditional discipline of the market, recent moves in improving corporate democracy are being driven by investor activism and institutional investor activism in particular. And this actually happened in the case of Amex. A lot of people think a market for independent directors may emerge because increasingly shareholders are looking to outsiders to take the lead on board issues. Marx and Minu actually have a really interesting argument. They say that the key to a good board is ownership. If a director's personal net worth is closely tied to the company, no director will remain silent if a 25% or 10% of their net worth is at stake. Yeah, that would be pretty scary. So here we are, back where we started once again, at the tail end of Unit 5, with this same concept of ownership. And we'll keep going through and back to ownership as we continue this module. Unit 6, the controversial issue of CEO compensation. And here I have a picture of the highest paid CEOs in Nigeria. Now, in this unit, we're going to be exploring the many issues that crop up when considering CEO compensation and the attempts that have been made to solve some of these issues. We'll be looking at the major challenges faced by CEOs, why CEOs fail, what the ideal CEO is even supposed to be, CEO compensation and employment contracts, stock options, and then we'll look at a case study that warms my heart, Jack Welch and GE. So again, just to reiterate, we'll be looking at challenges, CEO failure, the ideal CEO, and CEO compensation, which is the most controversial aspect of this whole unit. So what are the major challenges? I think at one point CEOs were actually viewed as kings, unaccountable to anybody. But post Enron and the global financial crisis, the king is dead. I think there's a lot more focus on accountability and performance now. There are more short runners, so people that stay CEO for short times, and fewer long runners. And I think it's a balancing act. You see, the CEO has to be powerful enough to do the job, but then accountable enough to make sure the job is done correctly. And there's another balance here. The CEOs want job security, but the shareholders want pay to be based on performance. So, in Nigeria, there's a saying that when you're trying to be inspiring, we call it aspire, perspire type of motivation. And, previously we wanted CEOs to be inspirational, but that people are sophisticated now. They want to look at numbers. No matter how inspirational you are, it can give a temporary boost to stock prices, but all of this inspiration, it has a very short shelf life. And then the reason why now there are more short runners than long runners is because shareholders want to avoid the success trap of long running CEOs, of being almost right and developing a kind of arrogance. Why CEOs fail? Okay, this is the easy part. When a company is failing, it will try almost anything. But when a company is successful, it doesn't even know why. So there's no hard and fast rules that you can say, okay, this is exactly how to be a successful CEO. And I think that that's the number one reason why some fail. Because you can do exactly the same thing as somebody else in a different industry at a different time, and it will not work out. But Fortune magazine actually has sort of a more distilled list of reasons. They say that CEOs fail for 3 reasons: people problems, execution problems, and decision gridlock. This is like a really interesting quote that I just stuck in here. And it's about sort of dishonesty, fraud. It's from Bethany McLean's book, actually, on the smartest guys in the room, about Enron. And sometimes CEOs are really put in a position where they feel they need to answer to shareholders, and they manipulate results, and that also causes failure. And I think that would be around, integrity problems as well. And I think that this quote from Bethany McLean explains a lot of these, not just the Enron, but a lot of these scandals. And she says, if you have a dog, or you need to create a doc on the financial statements, fortunately, there are specific accounting rules for what constitutes a doc. A dog has to have yellow feet. It has to have a white covering. It has to have an orange beak. So you take that dog and paint its feet yellow and its fur white, and then you paste an orange beak to its nose, and then you say to your accountants, this is a duck. Then you agree that it's a duck, and the accountant says, well, according to the rules, this is a duck. Everybody knows that it's a dog, not a duck. But it doesn't really matter because you've met the rules for calling it a duck. So we've spoken about CEO failure and what failed CEOs do. They have people problems, they have decision gridlock, they have integrity problems. But what do ideal CEOs do? And this is one of the more famous executives in Nigeria from one of the largest banks, Access Bank. This is another one of the famous CEOs from GT Bank. And what do CEOs and executives like this do differently? They have integrity, maturity, and energy. They have business acumen. They have people acumen. They're able to change. They're able to deliver on their commitments. They're curious. They're extremely orientated and hungry for knowledge. They're adept at developing, connecting development and spotting market patterns. And they have strong motivation and insatiable appetite for accomplishment and results. It's a combination of personal qualities like intuition and enthusiasm, and also the political skill. So the political skill refers to ability to get on with subordinates in a way that actually brings results and gets things done. Oh my gosh. This is going to be the most difficult part for me to talk about because it's the part where we talk about CEO compensation, and it's like a scene from a horror movie. And on the next slide, I think again I'm quoting Warren Buffett because he explains it best. Warren Buffett says that when the compensation committee, armed as always with support from a high-paid consultant, reports on the mega grant of options, the huge salary that they're going to give the CEO, it would be like belching at a dinner table for a director to suggest that that committee reconsider. So what Buffett is talking about is the boardroom atmosphere. Is really crucial in determining the type of salary that is given to a CEO rather than laws or legislation. And then there's two other concerns: the link between pay and performance, and also this idea of social inequality, right? And the idea that in more unequal countries, there's more of a gap between CEO pay and the lowest person in the organization or the most junior person in the organization, even though we haven't quite established a link between pay and performance. This is Dr. Michael Burry, and he's a medical doctor who has pursued a career, who later could pursued a career in finance, so kind of like me. But he is very famous because he was one of the people that spotted the trend in the subprime market, realized that it was unsustainable, bet against it, and made a huge amount of money both for himself and for his investors. But it's interesting that we're talking about the link between pay and performance because during the global financial crisis, as I'm sure a lot of you remember, share prices fell, several large banks became insolvent, and actually these banks wouldn't have been able to continue to finance their operations if it wasn't for government support. So in America, 9 banks collectively received $165 billion from the US government under the Troubled Asset Relief Program. Those same banks paid out almost $32 billion in bonuses this year, of which 47 presumably senior directors received bonuses of over $10 million. I wrote that nothing should disrupt the soft life. The soft life is a Nigerian expression, which means like a really comfortable lifestyle. And obviously, complete incompetence, fraud, you know, driving their banks to insolvency, um, couldn't disrupt their soft life. So why does this happen? Why are CEOs driving institutions to insolvency and still able to get these big bonuses? And it happens because of the small group of individuals at the top of the earning scale: rock stars, movie stars, athletes, investment bankers. Only CEOs get to pick the people that pay their compensation. And remuneration committees are supposed to be independent. But in reality, the CEO has power over who sits on the remuneration committee. And this is very different to movie stars. So Scarlett Johansson actually released a new movie called Black Widow. And Disney told her that she could get a certain percentage of all the cinema proceeds. So she was really happy with that because Disney had told her what she was going to get paid and she really liked that. But what Disney didn't tell her is that they were going to release it on their internet kind of Netflix service, which cut everything that she was going to earn because everybody just watched it at home. So she doesn't have the power to go back to the board of Netflix and Disney and influence them in any way. She wasn't there in the room when her compensation was being decided. And that's a normal situation, right? But CEOs actually are able to pick the people. She didn't pick the guys in Disney. She's essentially an employee, but they were able to pick. The CEOs are able to pick the people that set their compensation, which is why they get why there's this tenuous link between performance and pay. Tweet only had 2 songs. And I honestly, I liked her. I thought she was quite a good artist. But obviously nobody else did. And, the album flopped and her recording contract wasn't renewed. And that was the end of her. She was like a 2-hit wonder. But, her album failed. So she didn't get any remuneration for failure, right? Whereas, and that's the point. All of the high-paying professions, remuneration is closely related to performance. So like a Rihanna or a Taylor Swift, for instance, they get these high amounts of money because their records are selling. But CEOs, whether their records are selling or they're not selling, they still are able to get this remuneration, particularly in America. A second reason why CEOs get paid high amounts is even when they don't perform. A second reason why the CEOs get high amounts even when they don't perform is the way the performance is measured. And a lot of the time it's benchmarked to share price. However, there have been a few high-profile cases of shareholder activism involving large companies like GSK and Shell. And there has been some backtracking of overly generous awards. So the change is afoot. But um, it's not as common as one would like to see in corporate America, at least, and in a lot of developed countries. So this is me doing yoga. I do yoga like on the weekends, if I remember. And it's interesting that this kind of relates to what monks and minnows say about incentives. They say that there's no incentive plan that can make a weekend athlete like me into an Olympic gold medalist, and no incentive plan will make a CEO who is in over his head suddenly able to turn the company around. And they give a lot of reasons why incentives are flawed. They say that flawed incentives encourage excessive risk taking. Flawed incentives explain why the financial sector failed to innovate in ways that would be better for society. Poorly designed incentive structures often lead to creative accounting, like we discovered trying to make a dog into a duck, as we talked about in the earlier slides. they can distort provision of information, and then, the very design demonstrates a failure to understand risks and incentives, and maybe sometimes even a deliberate attempt to deceive investors. And we'll look at some of these case studies in the upcoming slides. So share buybacks. One of the increasingly controversial ways in which CEOs can manipulate their pay is through the misuse of share buybacks. So share buybacks have actually, when we're a bit naive, they were viewed as a way of returning value to public shareholders because they increase the share price. However, it's now become obvious how share buybacks can be manipulated to transfer wealth from shareholders to executives. So what they do is the executives have their own shares, and then they do a share buyback, and then the share price goes up, and then they dump and sell their shares. So they benefit from that capital gains, but they don't benefit because the company is doing better. They benefit because they've done a share buyback. And there's a relationship between share buybacks and income inequality. There's a relationship between share buybacks and unemployment. There's a relationship between share buybacks and economic instability, and also diminished capability. In fact, Lazonik, in a piece that he wrote for the Brookings Institute, which I analyze on the next slide, actually says that share buybacks should be banned completely. He calls for a decrease or even a ban in stock buybacks so that companies will be able to use these funds to finance capital expenditures, but more importantly, to attract and train and retain and motivate its career employees. And some of the funds made available by a buyback ban can even flow to government as tax for investments in infrastructure and human knowledge that can underpin the next generation of intervention. And I think that that's a very interesting perspective from him. Case study, HP. So in the case of HP, their former CEO, Carly Fiorina, received a golden handshake worth up to $42 million. Ms. Fiorina was actually dismissed for not making targets, but she had clauses written into her contract 5 years earlier that required that if she was not meeting targets and if she was forced to leave, that she should get $42 million. That's what happened. So this is, again, some of the incentives not being as logical as one would think. Stock options. Stock options are supposed to be incentives as well. And there's a US Senator, Carl Levin, that says that stock options are the 800-pound gorilla that has yet to be caged by corporate reform. Corporate scandals have shown how current US accounting rules are fueling these stock option abuses linked to excessive executive pay, dishonest accounting, non-payment of taxes. International accounting experts have already proposed treating stock options as an expense, and the FASB should follow their lead. Honest accounting of stock options would strengthen the accuracy of US financial statements and restore investor confidence in our markets. So again, it started with the best of intentions. A stock option is actually the right to buy back a company's stock at a fixed price for a fixed period. So stock options actually work by granting the CEO the right to purchase the stock, usually at today's price, for 5 or 10 years. That means that if the stock goes up, then the CEO can cash in. But if the stock price goes lower, then the CEO can refuse to exercise the right. So this actually seemed like the perfect way to align shareholder interest with the interest of the CEO, because the CEO is also an owner, right? So that's perfect. And it makes sure that he, over time, increases the share price. Or not? So stock auctions can actually be very problematic. As Berkshire Hathaway said in 1985, I'd be happy to accept a lottery ticket as a gift, but I'll never buy one. And that's the point, right? Every owner had to pay for the share, whereas the CEO gets given the share with no capital cost. Secondly, the link between a company's performance and the share price is actually not that well cut. So CEOs have also tried to manipulate the market and understand market sentiment in a way that they can drive the share price up without performing. So they've come up with these restricted locks that take a much longer time, maybe that become active on retirement, for instance. And these can improve alignment, but obviously reduce risk taking. AOL Time Warner, what a sorry case. So in 2003, AOL faced 6 class action lawsuits from shareholders because what they did, the executives, is that they inflated the price of AOL stock artificially without necessarily performing, and then did a share buyback program, and then obviously they all made gains on those shares, and then they sold them back to the market. And then obviously when everybody realized that the company was actually not doing well, the share price crashed. And what that was called was a pump and dump strategy. But shareholders are now becoming more savvy. We're wising up. And in 1998, only 3.5% of shareholders voted against stock options. That was when they thought they were a good idea. But by 1991, 12% voted against them. I'm finishing with the house that Jack built, which is a heartwarming story about one of the best CEOs to me of GE. Jack Welch became CEO of General Electric, and he was CEO in 1980. He became CEO and was CEO to 2001. He stepped down in 2001, winning awards such as Most Admired Company in the World, CEO of the Century. He delivered 23% growth in shareholder return per annum. Such a legend. And this is from the Harvard Business Case on GE. So GE was founded in 1878 by Thomas Edison. Jack became CEO in 1981. You know, for the first few years, he was kind of what everybody knew to be neutron Jack. So he was just like a machine cutting costs, right? He streamlined the workforce. He cut 60,000 jobs, and he had a sell, fix, or close strategy. So if you could not get to number 1 or number 2 in your industry, he would close you down. And Dangote also has done that in Nigeria, where if he's not number 1 or number 2 in a particular industry in Africa, then he closes the business down, sells it, whatever. So he changed a lot of metrics. So a lot of people were focusing on internal metrics. He changed to external metrics. He made $11 billion from divestments, made 370 acquisitions. Obviously, with this strategy, revenue grew modestly, profit kind of skyrocketed. And then he sort of morphed into what I call Jack 2.0. So he moved away from neutron Jack, started going soft, but effective. So he lectured in the development center, the school for GE employees. He had these workout sessions for all the departments where he would bring all the employees into a room and ask them to make different proposals while their boss wasn't in the room. Then he'd bring the boss out, and the boss had to quickly find out or figure out within a matter of seconds which proposal he was accepting, which proposal he wasn't accepting. He introduced stretch targets in order to, in addition to the normal projections. He changed culture by weeding out managers that were even delivering on numbers, but just didn't align with the culture. He did a service business, so the services, servicing and the services for the servicing and services to do with, say, jet engines, right? If you have a G engine on your plane, then it can be monitored remotely and fixed remotely. So he did that. Financial services through GE Capital, introduced Six Sigma to help with the quality issues. And then he was really interested in bringing players with the 4 E's. And his E's were things like energize, the ability to execute into the fold. And those were his closest sort of execution team. As his final sort of parting program, even though he was late to the internet game, he brought in a digital initiative to start to digitalize GE and turn GE into more of a technology company. So, in summary, we've spoken about the gap between compensation and performance, we've spoken about the ideal CEO, we've spoken about share buybacks, we've spoken about stock options, and we've spoken about this thorny issue and all the issues around CEO compensation. I hope you enjoyed the unit.